God, we thank you for bringing us together tonight. We thank you for the slightly warmer temperatures and the way that spring is moving into summer. God, we pray as we study tonight that you'd give us just a little more insight into how the Bible came about and also what the Bible means for us. We pray this in your Son's name. Amen. So I'll keep an eye out for folks who are coming in. So actually last Thursday night, I was having dinner with my mom and my sister and my brother-in-law and Shelly was there, and we were celebrating her 80th birthday. And when my reminder on my watch or my phone told me that class was supposed to start, I kind of missed being here. I didn't tell my mom that because we were at her dinner, but so just a little recap of where we've been. This has been a journey of looking at the Bible and its history, but also its development over time as a narrative that helps us grow in faith. And as I've been saying all along, the Bible doesn't tell us all there is to know about God. The Bible reveals to us what we need to know about God. There are varying degrees of opinion on this, but we learn about God through nature. We learn about God in a way through other people, but those other ways of knowing God have to fit within the words and the boundaries of the Bible. The Bible is literally when they called it a canon, canon, that word means measuring stick. And a measuring stick tells us a couple things. That we all use it to draw straight lines. So we use it to see if we're going in the right direction, but we also use it to see how far we can go. And so the canon is there to help us understand and discern what is true from the other sources where we learn about God. And so in our canon, in the Protestant Christian canon, there are 66 books still. Every week we've talked about this. There's still 66 books, 39 in the Old and 27 in the New. And we have been focusing on the New Testament. We're going to move into some of those early manuscripts now. Always important for us to remember that the Bible, the writing of the Bible, encompasses 2,000 or 3,000 years and different cultural worldviews, Hebrew culture and Greek culture, but also Persian culture, and it has those influences, and those influences enrich the stories that we read in the Bible. You're going to hear a lot more about this on Pentecost, so I won't labor it tonight. But Alexander the Great's conquest of the Western world and his imposition of a common language is the linguistic foundation for our New Testament. And we just can't underestimate how important that event is and how influential that was. I made a point, which I've kind of let fall off the list in recent weeks, but I made a point in the first half of our time together that much of the law and the histories of the Old Testament were compiled during times of exile or immediately following exile, oftentimes as a way to say, hey, let's read this more carefully so that we don't get into exile again. But I think it's important for us as we move now through the New Testament and into some of the history of how the Bible came to us over the years, is that much of the New Testament was written in crisis. So if the Old Testament is written in exile and in the aftermath of exile, which is a crisis itself, one of the central crisis moments in Israel's history, it's important for us to know that the New Testament's written in crisis too. And what do I mean by that? I mean the development and growth of the Christian faith within the context of the Roman Empire, an empire that already had a set of gods, most notably Caesar, who was considered to be a deity. If you were at church on Sunday, you heard that the announcement of Caesar's birth sounds an awful lot like the announcement we read in Luke of Jesus' birth. Even some of the same phrases, even the phrase good news. And so I think that's good for us to remember that that the Bible happens in context, and the context of the New Testament is a time of cultural crisis. And so that leads me to the thing I always say, which is the key to reading the Bible as it was intended is understanding the history and the historical context. But it's also important to know the kinds of writing that are involved in the Bible. And so just to review a little bit of where we were the last few sessions on the New Testament, because we've really not spent as much time here on the New Testament, because we spend more time in the New Testament in our own church life and probably in our own reading too. But 27 books in Koine Greek. There are quotes from other languages, most importantly, Aramaic, which was another dialect born out of exile. And so, all of these historical things that happen bear on the things that we read in the Bible. The thing that Jesus cries out on the cross is spoken in a dialect that came from a period of exile. Isn't that interesting? He quotes Psalm 22 in a dialect that Jews learned in exile, Aramaic. And so that dramatic moment in our Tenebrae service or in our readings during Holy Week, Abba, Abba, Lami Sabachthani, that is Aramaic for my God, why have you forsaken me? And so all of these cultures have an influence on the Bible. And I won't spend too much time on this, but there are 4 kinds of literature in the Bible. That's been an important part of our journey, so I don't want to let that go. There are Gospels or holy biographies. There's a history book. That's the book of Acts. And then there are these special kinds of letters called epistles. And then there is another book of apocalyptic, like we saw in the Old Testament, in Daniel and some in Ezekiel. The book of Revelation is written in that apocalyptic language. That's where the writer uses the unseen reality of the present to encourage a community in crisis or in persecution. The early church was made up of Jewish converts and people who came from other faiths altogether, and also significantly Romans who worshiped Caesar. And as I said on this past Sunday, in the letter to the Philippians, writing to a place that had deep patriotic and nationalistic roots, deep roots in worshiping Caesar, here Paul is saying there is no Lord but Jesus, which was sedition at that point. That was considered by the Romans an attempt to overthrow the power and authority of Caesar. And so the New Testament writings reflect all that diversity. There's a fair amount of Jewish background in the gospel writings. There's no doubt about that. But there are also some other things that I think are that reflect trying to reach out to people who believed at one point that Caesar was God and trying to teach them that it was Jesus. And so the last time we talked about Paul's letters are long by first century standards. The average letter in the Greco-Roman world was about 90 words long. Paul's shortest letter was about 350 words long. His average letter was 1,300 words long, as opposed to 90. So we call them epistles because they're these special kinds of letters from a person to pastor a community, but they're like little books. They would have been perceived to be more significant works than just letters. Some of them were written to private audiences, Philemon and Timothy and Titus, those are written to people. The other letters are written to communities. Paul didn't write his own letters. Papyrus was expensive, and there were special people who were trained to write on it. And Paul had people that he dictated his letters to, or that he left outlines, and they finished them. But oftentimes he signed them at the end and writes in the text, see by my signature that I'm writing to you personally. And then they have this structure of a greeting, and then the main body of the letter, and then a farewell, and also greetings to multiple people. You see that certainly at the end of Romans and a few of the other letters. And so we're not going to spend much more time on the books of the New Testament. I want to turn now to how these letters and biographies and histories, and then this wacky book at the end of Revelation, how that got circulated in the beginning, and how it started being shared and passed down from generation to generation. So let's, the initial question many of you might have is I can answer in one sentence. None of the original documents exist anymore. Now, initially, that's a troubling thing. We don't have any of the original gospels or letters or any of those things. But so everything we have is a copy. But before that causes too much discomfort, I want to say two things. One is, we don't have any of the original manuscripts of Plato or Aristotle or Cicero or any of those writers that that are still part of the Western canon of literature. And so that doesn't necessarily pose a problem. What's more is that some of the fragments of the biblical letters that we have are much closer to the time of writing than the oldest copies of Plato or Aristotle or Cicero or any of the great writers of the pre and immediately post-Jesus era. And so we have always counted on people to copy these works of literature and pass them down. And the books of the Bible are no different. The original documents were written on rolls of papyrus, which was, many of you will have seen papyrus at some point, or I know there was a trend of paper making that was a arts and crafts thing that people did 10 or 20 years ago, and oftentimes that was a lot like papyrus. It's made from organic material, and it rolls out. Turns out papyrus was pretty fragile. None of the people who were writing the Gospels or the epistles assumed that they'd be still being read 2,000 years later. So papyrus was the material that they had. Papyrus rolled. And even in the earliest days of the church, this was seen as an inconvenience for identifying a particular line or paragraph or idea in the text. You would have to roll it with one hand going this way and the other, and so but also the rolls of papyrus looked a lot like Jewish scrolls, and the early Christians wanted to differentiate themselves from the Jewish tradition. And so early non-Jewish Christians started copying the letters and things on parchment, which is different. It's rougher and tougher and easier to work with. It has some problems of curling on the edges and things, but parchment ended up being a huge part of how early Christian communities copied the Gospels and the letters of Paul and the other letters, and then also Revelation. So let's just look at, just for a minute, an example of one of the Gospels, the Gospel of Matthew, which whenever I mention it in church, I remind us that it was written to a Jewish audience, has a lot more Jewish references and assumptions about what people will know. So it was written to probably to a community in Jerusalem, which was where the concentration of Jewish Christians were. And so it would be written to them, and they would read it and they would realize, gosh, this is important writing and this is fragile, so let's copy it. So they get somebody right next to it with another big roll of papyrus and copy the Gospel of Matthew. And then, on the principle that if you have one, more is better, they copied them and distributed them. And so these gospels ended up being the foundational documents for churches that were being planted in homes and in communities from Jerusalem and then all the way through Israel, Palestine, and into the Roman Empire. And so, and then during that time, they were transitioning from papyrus to parchment. The other thing that is different about Christian scriptures from Jewish scriptures is I mentioned before that they didn't want them to be rolled so that they looked like scrolls of the Torah. And so it's the early Christian tradition that popularizes something called a codex. Now, a codex is not a word that we use very much, but a codex is a book with pages that's bound at one end. In other words, all of you have probably dozens or hundreds of codexes in your house. You just never called them that. So the codex started to take root in the early 2nd century. So that means like in the early 100s. And it was bound at one end with leaves that could be turned and searched easily, more easily than finding the place in the scroll with all the rolling from one end and then unrolling from the other or the other way around. It's easy for us to miss what a dramatic change this was for having access to the holy text. And so I think I told this, used this illustration early on in our time together, but it's very similar to the difference between a cassette and a CD. Now, a cassette has wheels, right, that have the tape. And in order to find the thing you want, you have to rewind or forward wind all of that tape to get to the place that you want it to be. That's called analog memory. Analog. It goes like from, it follows one thing from another. In other words, you got to chase that one spot. DVDs or CDs are called random access memory. Now, you know that on your computers because we always hear it as RAM. Remember when you bought a computer according to how much RAM it had? Random access memory means here's the memory. I want to go to this page and I can go there without unrolling the whole part before it and after it. Does that make sense? It's such a little thing, but it's huge for the way the Bible came to be used in Christian communities. And so in the year, but the copying of the Bible was a painstaking, long process. I'm going to show you some pictures in a little bit of some of the old manuscripts of the Bible. In the year 331 AD, Emperor Constantine had a pledge to build 50 new Christian churches in Constantinople. And that's Istanbul now, by the way. Now you have that song in your head. In Constantinople, and he ordered 50 complete copies of the Bible on parchment, bound at one end, to be created for these 50 new churches. It was a huge ask. It was a little, it was probably heard in that day the same way that Americans heard from John Kennedy that by the end of this decade, we're going to walk on the moon. Or the guy in during World War II, whose name I can't remember, who said, we need to build an armada of 25,000 planes. And everyone laughed at him. No one had ever built 25,000 planes before. By the end of the war, they'd built hundreds of thousands of planes. And so it was one of these things that was, it was an outlandish request, but it was also aspirational. That created 50 complete Bibles to be distributed to 50 new church plants in Constantinople. I want to show you what the pages of that Bible would have looked like. So I've got, I'm going to share a page. It's such an interesting format. This is what the Bibles would have looked like that Constantine ordered for those churches in Constantinople. Each page has four columns, sorry. It has room in the margins for individual churches to write things, to either to write commentary or to make notes, for the principal teachers to make their notes within the text of the Bible. So these are written with a function in mind. And this is a page from a very particular one of those codexes called Codex Sinaiticus. At the end of our time this evening, I'm going to tell you the story of how this book was found. But it's believed that this was one of the 50 that was ordered by Emperor Constantine. If I try and make it bigger, does that help? Yeah. So because they wanted to leave room for the church leaders to make notes and comments, but they also wanted to maximize space. This is all in capital letters, and there's no space between words. So I can identify Kai right here, K-A-I, that's and in Greek. Now don't ask me what the rest of the line says, but you can identify little words within there. And biblical scholars have been reading these now for centuries, since the old manuscripts started being found, and that's how and using those for translation purposes. Over the years, the Bible was copied into 3 parts of that part of the world, of the original part of the Christianized world. For simplicity's sake, we'll call it East, West, and North Africa. And so Bibles were taken into those regions, and then small particularities started popping up in the ways that those were copied. Remember, we're still 1,200 years from the first printing press. Any Bible that existed was written by hand, copied from another source. And I've got now this is really just to nerd out a little bit, but this is a family tree of the different manuscripts of the Bible. Now, here's what I was getting at. You have autograph just means the actual person wrote it. They go to Alexandria, that's the North African part, and then they have traceable lineage of Bible copying from the Alexandrian school. And then you have the Eastern, and that's split into where Antioch is and Caesarea, and they have their own little symbols. When you read a Greek Bible, these are how the footnotes look. And then the Western one, the Italian one, and then the wider part of Africa, the Roman part of Africa, which oddly enough seems like that ought to be Alexandrian, but that's not my area of history. But they all have things that make them particular, and the scholars who know these little pieces of manuscript identify little mistakes or quirks that that happened in one of these, because they appear in every Bible after them. See how that happens? If they're all copied, if the only thing you have to go on is the guy before you, you're going to repeat. If you're a good copyist, you're going to repeat his mistakes. And so this is a family tree of Bible manuscripts in the first few centuries of the church. A guy named Lucian in the year 310 took all of these and tried to create a standardized text. So after Lucian, the Western Church uses one text that was corrected to the best of their ability then. But here's the thing. These things circulate, and some of them are in papyrus and some are in parchment, and they circulate. And I don't know if you've got any old things laying around your house, but it not each other. They don't always last, right? And so just imagine a Bible that is the only Bible for an entire small church community gets a lot of use, and they start to fall apart. I say that because there are well over 5,000 partial manuscripts of the Bible that are very old, some of them going back to the early 2nd century, which means they may have been the second or third copy of that Bible. And so those are, I'm going to show you a couple of those, but all of those little pieces, especially since some of them are older than the complete Bibles, those end up helping us correct errors in the later Bible. Here's the principle. If I have a Bible, but I find an older copy that has it different, it's the older copy that's more accurate of the original language Bibles, not ours. And so if you look at the end of the Gospel of Mark, most of our Bibles will have a little line. So Mark has 16 chapters, and at verse 8 of the last chapter, it says, "Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb." They had just witnessed the empty tomb, and they said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. Well, most of us, until just a generation or so ago, had a whole rest of the chapter, another 10 verses or so, that kind of resolved the story. Then when Jesus rose on the first day, and then it ends at the end, after the Lord Jesus had spoken to them, he was taken up into heaven. Somebody went in later and said that ending, where they all just run out into the darkness, afraid to talk about this, that's not a suitable ending. And so they added an ending. But the oldest manuscripts of Mark do not have the ending. And so my Bible has it. Can you see that little message right there? It says, "The earliest manuscripts and other ancient witnesses do not have verses 9 to 20. And so after creating the King James and creating some of the other English Bibles, they found that as they kept doing archaeology and finding older manuscripts, none of the oldest ones had those last 10 verses. And so most of our Bibles have a little line there, and it says most of the ancient witnesses don't have this. One of the stories of the woman at the well is also not in the oldest copies of that gospel. And so that's the way biblical archaeology and translation works. You have an authoritative text of the Greek Bible, the whole New Testament, but then you find something that's older and it corrects your authoritative text. And some of the pieces that correct the errors are tiny, I'll show you a picture of those in a minute. But I want to spend just a minute on the kinds of mistakes that got passed down through time and what the preeminent scholar of this attributes the reasons for that happening. So this is a really good book. There are parts of it that read like a spy novel. I'm going to share one story from it, but it's called The Text of the New Testament. Its transmission, its corruption, and its restoration. And this is written by Bruce Metzger, who, sorry, Jack's not here. Bruce Metzger was Jack's New Testament professor at Princeton. So there are unintentional errors, and he lists them as errors from faulty eyesight. For example, remember, no bright fluorescent lights, no backlit screen. This is done by candlelight by monks who didn't do anything else but this. Confusion of similar letters, resulting in different words or skipping lines. There's one mistake in a long series of biblical manuscripts because the scribe jumped a line and left out a line. And everyone who used that one, that guy's copy to copy, left out that line too, because it wasn't in his. And so there are these errors from unintentional changes that come from mistakes like that. There are errors of the mind, like substitution of synonyms. Like sometimes a monk might presume that, hey, this word works better than that one. It means the same thing. Let's put that one in. And you don't really realize that the monk did it until you find an older manuscript. There are sometimes variations in the sequence of words. After the 4th and 5th and 6th century, Greek is not the common language. Greek is a language that people learn in order to do this work, like I did, like Loanne did. It wasn't the language that they spoke. And so later on, there are some things that maybe somebody thought, hey, I think it works better this way, so I'm going to switch these words around. And then there are Metzger calls them errors of judgment, explanatory notes in the margins of texts that got incorporated into the text itself. So in other words, you've got one of those Bibles with lots of room in the margins and somebody's written a really good note. The next scribe might say, hey, that should be in the body of the text. And they put it in the body of the text, and then every text after that one has that note. And it's not until you find an older one that you correct it, that you find a corrected text. There are, though, some intentional changes. Those are the unintentional ones. Intentional changes can be, for example, correcting spelling or grammar, thinking that you can shine up Paul's prose. Intentionally fixing the text to make it align with a similar passage, like the 2 different versions of the Lord's Prayer in Matthew and in Luke. Clearing up historical or geographical difficulties, sometimes editing what were thought to be mistakes, such as how a place was described or which prophet a quotation was attributed to. And then there's alterations made because of doctrinal considerations, literally taking things out because a couple of centuries after it happened, it felt problematic to leave it in there. And then addition of details. And there's a couple of examples. In some ancient manuscripts, but not the best ancient manuscripts, someone decided to give the 2 criminals being crucified next to Jesus names. And then everybody who copied that guy's Bible after that copied the names until it was corrected later on. And then there are some details even about Jesus' baptism that one scribe decided needed to be in the text, and then everyone who copied that scribe's work included those stories until they were corrected later. So I hope that's, we're not done with that part, but I hope that's interesting. Just, we see the Bible as one book, but it circulated in pieces for such a long time. And then over centuries, dedicated men and women have put together these scripts and these fragments to make sure we have the most accurate rendering of what the original Bible actually said. I want to show you what an ancient piece of papyrus looked like, because I think this is kind of cool. Oh, may have lost that one. Oh no, it's over here. This is what a scroll of papyrus looked like. This is the older than parchment version. Did I show you this already? No, I think I showed you the other one with the order. So this is a papyrus of Romans 15, 29 to 33. And I'm just looking at it and thinking, the way that the writing slants, I wonder if this person was left-handed. But that's for a better scholar than me. This is how the original copies of the biblical books looked before they moved to parchment, and it had that sharper, clearer look that we saw in the other slide. And then there is a little piece of the Gospel of John that I want to show you. Here it is. May have messed this one up, but no, here we go. So this is a small fragment of the Gospel of John. It is a precious fragment because it corrected something that had been long misrepresented in John 18 by changing a word, by changing the sense of a word or the tense or whatever. This is an older piece of John's gospel than any of the other pieces that had been used for translation. And can you imagine finding that and being such a good scholar in Greek, and not just of the Gospel of John, because first you got to place it in the New Testament and then decide it's in John, and yeah, it's in chapter 18. Some amazing work went into the Bibles that we have on our in our books and on our phones and all kinds of things. So I just want to make sure we're clear on the older is better principle. That ought to be that's a relief to me. I turn 60 next week. Older is better. It is just a logical thing that not only is older better, but the more awkward the reading is, the more likely it is that it's the right reading. So old and awkward, which has always been a problem for a lot of people, all of a sudden it's the way to go. And here's why. No one changes a manuscript to make it more awkward. No one takes a story out of Jesus' mouth and said, let's make him sound angrier. Right? The changes that happened in the Bible happened because people wanted to smooth those things out. And so when you find one and you go, oh my goodness, that is such a harsh story, or that's such a strange story, you can almost be sure that that's the more accurate copy, that that's the more accurate or older reading. Because if it was a smooth reading, now sometimes there are smooth readings that go back and you don't find anything that that changes that. But if you find something that has an awkward, harsh, difficult reading, it's more likely that that's accurate, because no one would change it to make it like that. So I think that part's interesting too. All of the work that goes into to looking at these manuscripts, the big pages, but also those little fragments. And there, like I said, there are 5,000 partial fragments of the New Testament. Each one of them has a number. And in the Greek New Testament that I have in my office, if there's a correction that is the result of one of those fragments, like I just showed you, it has its own footnote. Fragment number 2312 told us that this was the right word to put in that verse. Isn't that interesting? So, but how did we get all this stuff? That's an interesting thing. And, for the history geeks here, that we all have a moment of silence every so often for the library at Alexandria. The library at Alexandria, which burned down with basically a copy of every ancient manuscript that ever existed, presumably multiple copies of the entire Bible. And so but archaeologists, amateurs at times, and also professionals have been scouring the world looking for new finds of old manuscripts. In 1844, a 30-year-old German nobleman who was also a Bible scholar was traveling around in the Sinai Desert, and he was looking for manuscripts, looking for old things. This was his thing. So this is 1844. He knocks on the door of a convent out in the desert and asks, gives his credentials. He's a clergyman. He's a biblical scholar. He wants a place to stay. So they invite him in. He's at the table, and he notices that near the oven, there are these bound rolls of parchment, and they're using them to fire the oven. They're burning them to heat up the oven to bake bread, presumably every day. And he asks if he can look at one. And he pokes it up, and he knows enough to know that the 25 or so sheets of parchment that he has in his hand are older than anything they've got in the museums of Germany. And so he starts, he actually tells this story that he asked if he could take 25 leaves to his room. He tells them not to burn them anymore. And he says, can I take 25 leaves of these to my room? And he stayed up all night reading them, identifying where they came from, doing a little bit of translation work. He said in his diary, it felt like it would be sacrilege to sleep. So he stays up all night. He goes down to the monks and the nuns and says, can I have these? I'll pay you for them. And they were, it was a poor order. And so they took his money, and he took those back to Germany. Well, they sent him right back to try and negotiate for the other things that were there, because there were tons of manuscripts and they were burning them. And so by that time, they knew they had something valuable, and they ended up negotiating for when he found the oldest, what is still today, the oldest complete copy of the New Testament. I showed you, that's the one with the 4 columns on it. They negotiated a government to pay them the modern day equivalent of $500,000 for that manuscript. It went to Germany, and then it went to Russia. And then Russia was cash poor after the Russian Revolution, with currency that actually meant something. And so they sold it to the British. And it is open and on view every single day in the British Library. It was the first thing I took people to see when I had visitors who would care, and sometimes even if they didn't care, I would take them and show them. Sinaiticus is what it's called. It's named after the Sinai where it was found. Sinaiticus is the oldest complete copy of the New Testament. Now, there are older pieces than Sinaiticus, but it's the oldest one that is all put together. And most people believe it's probably one of the Bibles from the early 300s that was part of Constantine's church plant program in Constantinople. There are a bunch of other things that were found there, but the story of Sinaiticus and this guy monkeying his way, hiking across the desert with a cloak and a staff and a backpack, trying to get there to rescue more ancient documents. It's a great story. And oddly enough, that's a story that's in this book. Were you trying to get a look at that, Tad? It's Bruce Metzger. So there have been people like that out there looking for old manuscripts and old copies of the Bible so that we can put together a more accurate Bible. Now there was, this is an important thing only because it'll bear on next week. In the century or so, centuries before the Reformation and before the printing press, the church decided it had the best manuscript that could ever be assembled. And it's called, if you read these things, it's called the Textus Receptus. It is the received text. And it is the Greek text that's used to create the King James Bible, the New Testament part of the King James Bible. And you will find in Christian communities, primarily in fundamentalist Christian communities, that the Textus Receptus is still considered to be the authoritative Greek manuscript of the Bible. Even though in the years since it was compiled, we've found many, many thousands of older pieces of those manuscripts. Okay, I'm going to open this up for questions because I think this part, there's more history. We're going to get to the history of the English Bible next week. Let me open that up and say, what do you have for me?
Oh my God.
Go ahead, Bert.
Well, just a couple of comments. Several weeks ago, I looked up some information about Codex or Codex, whatever, and the author of that said the word book came along when paper replaced papyrus or parchment.
Yeah.
And so if any of us have a Codex, it's quite an ancient thing.
Yeah, I suppose that's true. Yeah. Although, because I was in the book trade for a while, this is still referred to as a codex.
All right.
In a research library, I'm pretty sure if you even go online and look up a book in a research library, at least when I was doing research, they still referred to these things as codexes.
All right.
Because it differentiates it not from scrolls, but from loose leaves. Like there were some things that I looked up in research libraries that were folders of loose pieces of paper. So Codex told me on the library card that it was bound.
Well, then that PBS program of a couple of years ago about the invention of writing had a complete demonstration of how to make papyrus.
Wow. Yeah.
Out of the reeds. And that sheet that you showed, if you look closely in it, you can see the interwoven pieces of they're overlaid like a lattice top pie, weaved together and pressed. And you can see those little bit of ribs of the reeds in that picture.
Yeah, That's exactly right. And those are easy to look up. You look up papyrus, ancient papyrus, and you'll see pictures of it on the computer. The so does that feel destabilizing for you at all, to know that, you know, the book that we place so much significance on has gone through, I mean, there are times where certain things could have been lost forever, but weren't. And I am always struck by the skill and the faithfulness and the tenacity of the monks who did the copying. And when I say did the copying, I mean from generation to generation. Monks aren't having kids, so it's not like you're born into the family business. These are new people coming into this life, seeing what it's like from the outside, and still engaging in this life of a scribe for 1,500 years. So what is the US, about 250 years old? Yeah. So that's that's 6 times as long as the US has been around. People were copying the Bible with a life expectancy, probably, let's be generous, of around 45 or 50. And so I'm astonished every time I get back into this story of how the Bible comes to us. And I hope you are too. I think that gives us a little reverence for the book. Is that Margot or Tim with a question?
It's me, but I think
Yeah.
Tad was first.
Oh, Tad, bring it.
Well, he's
You're
Muted.
Sing out.
the first one is, personally, I find it reassuring that there are all these flaws.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, to me, it makes it more believable and more comfortable. That's personal. The second, was it safe to assume that Codex you showed us was Greek?
Yes, I'm sorry. That was Greek. Yeah.
And the last question is, where they were burning those scrolls, was that northern Florida or southern Florida? Sorry. I retract that.
That's okay. We know it wasn't at Disney World. Yes, Margot, please.
So in thinking of the translations and looking at them and seeing that there is no punctuation.
Yeah.
And thinking two things. One is, as we've done genealogy stuff and you look at census reports and you look at the writing and it changes from entry to entry, what you might find depending upon who translated it or wrote it down. And also thinking, you know, one of my favorite books is Each Shoots and Leaves.
Yeah.
So without punctuation, the stories can change immensely.
They can.
And we don't have any clue about that, right?
Well, what you have alongside the ancient manuscripts, you have some letters and other documents that survived from church leaders at the time. So people to look up are people like Eusebius, that's Eusebius, and Irenaeus, Irenaeus. Or just look up, sorry for the gender exclusivity here, but look up the church fathers, the early church fathers, because they corresponded with each other and oftentimes they refer to sections of books. And that's one of the ways that translators confirm what's in the books, is by contemporary or near contemporary writings about them. Isn't that interesting? But Eusebius and Irenaeus are the two that come to mind. And for example, one of them, and I can't remember which one now, but one of them is credited with the earliest authoritative list of Paul's letters, because he wrote it in a letter to somebody else. So, and those have, the only reason those have survived is because people realized that even though they weren't scripture, they were important, and those got copied over time too. There are some amazingly brilliant theologians and Bible scholars in the first 3 or 4 centuries of the church. I mean, people whose brains will blow you away without the benefit of any modern knowledge at all. They are still more than 1,000 years from the Renaissance. They're more than, well, if you're in the 3rd century, you're 1,500 years from the scientific method. And so these are people who, whether it's, I'm Presbyterian, so there are no coincidences. This is providence. This is God's providing of men, and I would assume some women in those early days who talk about these things, who learn these things, who pass these stories along and ensure that we have the scriptures. Now, the idea of Greek not having punctuation or spaces between the words shouldn't shock us too much when we remember that ancient Hebrew had no vowels, right? So remember, there's that project, the Masoretes, they have this project where it takes them centuries to put the vowels in the Old Testament.
Wow.
And so this has been a part of the transmission of the biblical record from century to century to century, from millennium to millennium, and now to millennium. It is the work of faithful, diligent people who, weren't on the softball team. They didn't go to movies. They didn't play. They did this, and we benefit from it. Brooke, I see your hand there.
Yeah, how in the original 50, how long did it take for each one to be written?
I never got to the end of that story, and I'm sure it was multiple scribes working at the same time, because it was the emperor giving the command. It could have been 100 scribes working on the 50 Bibles.
Yeah.
But when you think about how hard it was for a whole Bible to come into being, somebody with the power to order 50 of them into being, that's a huge thing. That's 50 copies that went out and that got copied themselves. And, it's like they told 2 friends and they told 2 friends. It is the exponential growth and spread, not just of the Bible, but of the gospel.
So how did the corrections get disseminated? How does that happen?
Well, you mean the errors or the corrections to the errors?
Yes.
Okay. I see what you did there, Brooke, even though I don't see you. So the errors, the easiest analogy, and this every seminary student hears this in the first year, is it's a game of telephone, right? So you sit in a circle and you tell the first person something, and their job is to tell the next person, but so no one can hear it. And you goes around the circle, and by the end, it's a completely different sentence. And so that's how the errors spread. The way the errors are corrected, to use that analogy again, is to find what was said or written by one of the earliest speakers in that circle. So you might not find the original line, but you might find the second or third person where it's still pretty intact. And so that's how the errors, that's an analogy for how the errors got corrected. They would find one of those fragments and say, oh, this changes the way we understand Mark 6. So we better change that in the standard copy of the Greek that we use to make our translations.
Okay.
Just in the last 100 years, I'm going to look this up while I talk, but there's a standard Greek Bible that all Bible translators use. And I'm just looking it up. It is in its 29th edition.
Wow.
And it's in its 29th edition because that's how many important things were found between the first and the second and the third and the fourth, fifth and sixth, down to the 29th. And so if you are nerdy enough to read the introduction to the NIV, where it talks about the group of scholars that got together from different traditions to translate the Bible, it was probably about the 20th edition then of Nestle Aland. Nestle like the candy bar, and then Aland, A-L-A-N-D. That's the standard Greek text. And it's the one that Bible translators use. And when a new edition comes out, the Bible translators have to go and see if they got their translations right. Yeah, Tim.
So when did the new King James version, not the new, the King James version? It was
King
in the
James, yeah.
12th to 13th century?
Yeah, we're gonna do that in detail next week, but it's 1611,
Okay.
and it's and the critical, crucial figure in the we're going to get a lot of Stuart and Tudor history next week, because you cannot get the English Bible without those two royal houses. But the William Tyndale is the critical figure. And just to not bury the lead, William Tyndale is hunted down, strangled, and burned for his work. But our New Testament today, the NIV, the New King James, New American Standard, still uses about 70% of Tyndale's translation work. That's how good he was. And got killed for his trouble. So what this all points to, and what we'll get to next week, is the Reformation, the belief, and that is part of the reforming of the Roman Catholic Church, was the belief that it shouldn't just be a group of priests and bishops and cardinals and monks who could read the Bible. That with the advent of the printing press, the Bible should be made available to a wider audience. But 150 years before the printing press, there was an Englishman who wanted to get Bibles into everybody's hands too. And that's where we'll start next week. How's that for a teaser? I've been watching too much TV. That's John Wycliffe, by the way. Any other final questions or comments as we go? Let me offer a prayer of thanks for the faithful believers who brought us our Bible and saved our Bible from whatever was happening in their year. Let's pray together. God, we thank you for the words that you've given us, and we've spent so much time talking about how they got here and where they've been and what's in them. But today we just offer thanks for the countless nameless scholars and scribes who copied the Bible faithfully and accurately, and who made it possible for us to read your revealed word today. We give you thanks for them. We honor their work by continuing to read and struggle to read and understand the Bible for ourselves. And we pray that this and the other weeks that we've been together would energize that process for us. May we read these words and be transformed into the disciples that you call us to be. We pray this in your Son's name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, John.
Thank you, John.
So much fun.
You said something that resonated about times of crisis.
Yeah.
And, you know, in the world, in that history, doesn't it just bounce from one period of crisis to another?
Well, it does. A historian would tell you that no one writes about peacetime.
Doesn't
And
sell.
right. And no creeds are written apart from crisis. right? If you were in the creeds class, was that 2 summers ago already? The creeds class, we learned that every important creed was born out of some kind of church or theological crisis. And I think the same is true for the Bible. You know, you've got, for example, anybody who needs to leave is welcome to go. I'm just going to keep yammering here as long as questions are here, because we only have a limited number of times together. But the book of Revelation, it's believed that John, or whoever John's writer was, took down the details of that vision as a way to encourage people who were under persecution from Rome. And so all the multi-winged creatures and multi-eyed beasts and all those things that people try and understand, you know, I got to understand what, you know, chapter 12, verse 17 means. But it's the whole story that means something. And the whole story is meant to be the cosmic battle that God is waging against evil so that we can live and thrive. And so I think all of those are born in crisis. Mark's gospel ends with the women not going back and telling Peter and John about the resurrection, but running off scared into the woods. I may have added the woods part, but they run off scared. And so even Mark's gospel ends in crisis, and that's after the resurrection. But Mark's writing to Christians in Rome. And Rome is not an easy place to be a Christian. So there are all kinds of stories like that that help us understand what it was so that we can make sense of what it is. Anyway, I could keep you here all night, which I won't do. But next week, and if you guys want to read ahead on this stuff, now it's stuff that's just widely available and out there. But next week, we're going to talk about how the English Bible came about. And that is as exciting as any spy novel. Tyndale gets killed. Wycliffe, I'm spoiling one of the stories for next, but Wycliffe he dies in his bed. He dies a happy man. They dig him up and burn his corpse.
Oh my God.
So that's the other thing. All this stuff, even Bible translation, the best of it happened in crisis. And so, and the Reformation, make no mistake, the Reformation is an ugly crisis that started wounds that continue to this day. For all the good that it did, and for all that, you know, we are with a capital R, we are a reformed tradition church. But don't for a second think that was a sweet period of history. We'll talk next week about what happened to the Anabaptists who rebaptized people who were already baptized. Their punishment was drowning.
Oh my God.
Because it fit the crime. So it's in that context that you get Bible translation into individual languages. So Charlotte, please, I'm sorry.
How does the Peterson Bible fit in with all of this?
Oh gosh, I don't know. Let me look. I don't know that one. Is it come from a particular?
Well,
Message.
it's more like just
Eugene Peterson. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
So Eugene Peterson. So those of you who were Christians in the 70s may have had a copy of the Living Bible.
Right.
And the Living Bible was not a translation from Greek and Hebrew. It was a paraphrase of an older English translation. So actually it was a paraphrase of the King James Bible. So in other words, it might say, "Thou art the smiteful God" in the King James, and in the Living Bible, it would say, "You're a vengeful God." And so it paraphrased what it was without going back to the original language. The Message, which is the Peterson Bible, he was a Bible scholar of both Greek and Hebrew, and he translated from the original language into more common language. And so while it's not a technical translation, it is a translation, which makes it head and shoulders above the Living Bible. Yeah, Eugene Peterson, there aren't a lot of modern saints, but I think he's about as close as we get in this last generation, apart from some of the martyrs in developing countries that gave their lives for the faith, like Oscar Romero and people like that.
So who's in charge of that, the Greek version you were talking about, the most accurate version that we have? Who's in charge of that?
It's a consortium of people, but it's Nestle Aland is the that's what it's called. So it's as you might expect, or maybe not, most of the technical biblical scholarship over the last 150 years took place in Germany. And so there is and that's complicated by the First and Second World Wars.
Yes.
Because American fundamentalists assumed that that these Germans who were changing the Bible, i.e. making it more accurate, it was actually a German plot.
Can you turn that
So,
up loud?
so yeah, but it's I'm almost certain that's a German group, Nestle Aland. Kurt Aland definitely was German. But anyway, it's fun stuff, right?
Yes.
Boy, if you think history's exciting, you ought to try accounting.
I don't know if my heart could bear it, Tad. So, hey, thanks for sticking with me the extra minutes. I
You
will
can
see
stay,
you-
the game's over.
Okay, good. That's all right.
Who won, Tad?
Oh, I don't want to ruin this holy moment.
Oh my gosh, yeah, it's over for sure. And no good outcomes tonight. Not the Lakers, not the Dodgers. Anyway,
You're not
the
supposed
dog's
to
about to bark.
spoil.
Kelly's pulling in. I got to go make dinner.
All right.
I'll see you on Sunday.
Sunday.
Thank you very
you.
much.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
John.
Good night.
Everybody.